5 young filmmakers packed their gear into 2 weathered SUVs on a crisp October morning in 2018, their breath visible in the cold mountain air as they prepared for what they believed would be the adventure of a lifetime. Blake Morrison, 27 years old with an infectious smile and dreams bigger than his small-town upbringing, had convinced his 4 closest friends to join him on an ambitious documentary project deep within the restricted zones of Cascade National Forest. The group consisted of Luna Rodriguez, a talented camera operator known for her steady hands and fearless attitude, Cody Walsh, their sound engineer who could capture audio in impossible conditions, Sienna Park, their researcher who had spent months studying the untouched wilderness they planned to document, and Jasper Kim, their survival expert who guaranteed he could keep them safe in any situation the forest might throw at them. They had permits for the outer regions of the park, but Blake had bigger plans that he hadn't shared with the park authorities or even fully with his team. Their goal was simple yet dangerous: to film the last truly untouched wilderness in North America, a section of forest so remote and protected that no human had officially set foot there in over 50 years. Blake had spent 2 years researching this project, convinced that their documentary could change how people viewed conservation and the natural world. What none of them knew was that their permit applications had caught the attention of someone who had very different ideas about who should be allowed in those woods. Gerald Hawthorne worked as a senior coordinator for the Park Service, a man in his late 50s who had built his career on controlling access to the wilderness areas under his jurisdiction. Hawthorne had a reputation among the staff for being unnecessarily harsh with permit applications, often denying requests for reasons that seemed petty and personal rather than based on legitimate safety concerns. When Blake's initial permit request landed on Hawthorne's desk, something about the young filmmaker's enthusiasm and determination triggered a deep anger in the older man. Hawthorne had spent decades watching what he called amateur adventurers request access to areas he considered his personal domain, and he had developed an almost pathological need to maintain control over who could enter the wilderness. He approved Blake's permit for the standard tourist areas while secretly planning to make sure the group never made it to their real destination. Hawthorne had connections throughout the park system, including relationships with local guides and outfitters who owed him favors from years of permit approvals and denials. The morning of their departure, Blake uploaded a video to their documentary's social media page, showing the 5 friends loading their equipment and talking excitedly about their plans. Luna filmed Blake as he explained their mission to capture footage of pristine wilderness that had never been documented before, while Cody tested his recording equipment and Jasper checked their survival gear one final time. Sienna reviewed her research notes, pointing out rare plant species they hoped to find and document. The video showed 5 passionate young people ready to chase their dreams, completely unaware that their enthusiasm had already marked them as targets in Gerald Hawthorne's twisted mind. If you believe that people pursuing their dreams shouldn't be sabotaged by those in power, hit that subscribe button now. Only control freaks and manipulators like Hawthorne would want to stop you from supporting independent filmmakers trying to make a difference. Hawthorne had recommended a specific guide service to Blake's team, claiming that the guides knew the safest routes into the deeper wilderness areas. What Blake didn't know was that Hawthorne had specifically chosen guides who were known for their willingness to cut corners and take dangerous risks with client safety. The guide service, run by a man named Dale Kruger, had several safety violations on record, but Hawthorne had used his influence to keep those violations from becoming public knowledge. Kruger owed Hawthorne multiple favors, and when Hawthorne called him with special instructions about Blake's group, Kruger was eager to help. The plan was simple and cruel. Kruger would guide the filmmakers deep into the restricted areas they wanted to access, but he would abandon them there without proper directions back to civilization. Hawthorne believed this would teach them a lesson about respecting authority and following rules, never considering that his lesson could easily become a death sentence for 5 young people whose only crime was having dreams that didn't fit his narrow vision of who deserved access to nature. On their second day in the forest, Blake's team met with Kruger at a predetermined location near the boundary of the restricted area. Kruger appeared friendly and knowledgeable, showing them maps and discussing the best routes to reach the untouched wilderness they wanted to film. He explained that he would guide them to the perfect location and then return 3 days later to lead them back out, giving them time to capture the footage they needed while ensuring they didn't get lost in the vast wilderness. The arrangement seemed perfect to Blake's trusting team, who had no reason to suspect that Kruger had no intention of returning for them. Kruger led the 5 filmmakers deeper into the forest than any of them had ever ventured before, following trails that seemed to disappear and reappear at his command. The guide moved with confidence through terrain that looked identical in every direction, past towering pine trees and over rocky streams that all blended together in the minds of the increasingly tired team. Luna kept her camera rolling during the hike, capturing stunning footage of untouched wilderness while Cody recorded the natural sounds of the forest around them. Sienna documented plant species she had only read about in research papers, her excitement growing with each rare discovery. Jasper monitored their location with GPS devices, though he noticed their signals were becoming weaker the deeper they traveled into the restricted zone. On their 3rd morning, Kruger woke the team before dawn and told them he had found the perfect location for their documentary, a pristine valley that had never been filmed before. He led them down a steep trail into a secluded area surrounded by dense forest, where ancient trees created a natural cathedral of green light and shadow. Blake was thrilled with the location, immediately planning shots that would showcase the untouched beauty of the wilderness. Kruger helped them set up their base camp, showed them nearby water sources and marked several locations on their map, where he claimed they could find the best footage opportunities. After sharing a quick breakfast with the team, Kruger shouldered his pack and announced he was heading back to town for supplies, promising to return in exactly 3 days to guide them out of the forest. He warned them to stay within the valley area and not to venture beyond the landmarks he had shown them, claiming that the surrounding terrain was dangerous and easy to get lost in. Blake thanked him enthusiastically, already envisioning the incredible documentary they would create in this perfect location. None of them suspected that Kruger had just handed them a death sentence disguised as an opportunity. The first day without their guide went exactly as planned. Blake and Luna worked together to capture sweeping shots of the valley's untouched beauty, while Cody recorded the crystal-clear sounds of wind through ancient trees and water flowing over moss-covered rocks. Sienna cataloged plant and animal species that she had never seen in the wild, filling pages of notes that would support their documentary's environmental message. Jasper maintained their camp and monitored their supplies, confident that 3 days would give them enough time to film everything they needed without straining their resources. By the 2nd day, their footage was already beyond their wildest expectations. They had captured scenes of wildlife behavior that had never been documented, including a family of wolves that appeared completely unafraid of human presence. The valley seemed to exist in a time before human interference, exactly the kind of pristine wilderness that Blake had dreamed of sharing with the world. Luna's camera work was flawless, Cody's audio was pristine, and Sienna's research was providing fascinating context for every shot they captured. Even Jasper, usually focused on practical concerns, found himself moved by the raw beauty surrounding them. Meanwhile, back at park headquarters, Gerald Hawthorne was monitoring radio communications and satellite tracking data, watching for any sign that Blake's team was trying to call for help. He had convinced himself that a few days of being scared and uncomfortable would teach these young filmmakers to respect authority and follow proper procedures. Hawthorne had justified his actions by telling himself that modern young people needed to learn hard lessons about preparation and respect for rules, never acknowledging that his real motivation was a sick need to control and punish anyone who challenged his authority. On the morning of the 3rd day, Blake's team packed their gear and waited at the predetermined meeting point for Kruger's return. They were tired but exhilarated, convinced they had captured footage that would change how people thought about wilderness conservation. Hours passed with no sign of their guide, and by afternoon, Jasper was beginning to express concern about their situation. The GPS devices were showing weak signals, and their maps indicated they were much deeper in the wilderness than any of them had realized during their hike-in. As evening approached without any sign of Kruger, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were alone in restricted wilderness with limited supplies and no clear path back to civilization. Blake tried to maintain optimism, suggesting that Kruger might have been delayed by weather or vehicle problems, but Jasper's survival training was telling him that something was seriously wrong. Luna and Cody began checking their equipment to make sure their batteries would last long enough to continue documenting their situation, while Sienna reviewed her research to see if her notes contained any information that might help them navigate out of the valley. If you can't stand people like Hawthorne who abuse their power to hurt innocent people, hit that like button right now. Only bullies and control freaks would support someone who puts lives at risk just to feed their own ego. That night, as they huddled around their campfire and tried to plan their next move, none of them could have imagined that their situation was about to become far more dangerous than simple abandonment in the wilderness. Deep in the forest around their camp, something was watching them, something that had been observing their every move since the moment Kruger had left them alone. The untouched wilderness they had come to document was not as empty as they had believed, and the presence lurking in the shadows had very different plans for their fate than anything Gerald Hawthorne had envisioned. The presence watching Blake's team from the darkness had a name, though he had not spoken it aloud in over 15 years. Vincent Merrick had once been a park maintenance worker, a quiet man in his early 40s who had gradually become obsessed with what he saw as the corruption of pure wilderness by careless visitors. His descent into madness had begun slowly, with small acts of sabotage against campers who left trash or damaged trees, but had escalated over the years into something far more dangerous. Merrick had been living illegally in the deepest parts of the restricted zone for over a decade, surviving off stolen supplies and small game while nurturing a growing hatred for anyone who dared to enter what he considered his sacred domain. When Merrick first spotted Kruger leading the 5 filmmakers into his territory, his initial reaction was familiar anger at yet another group of intruders violating his wilderness sanctuary. But when he observed Kruger abandoning the young people and leaving them stranded, something darker awakened in Merrick's twisted mind. He realized that these particular trespassers had been delivered to him like a gift, isolated and helpless in terrain that he knew better than anyone alive. For the first time in years, Merrick felt something approaching joy as he began planning how to deal with these latest invaders of his private kingdom. Back at park headquarters, Gerald Hawthorne was beginning to feel the first stirrings of unease about his plan. 3 days had passed since Kruger was supposed to retrieve Blake's team, and the guide had not reported back as promised. Hawthorne tried calling Kruger's phone repeatedly, but the calls went straight to voicemail. When he finally reached Kruger's office, he was told that the guide had left town suddenly, claiming a family emergency that would keep him away for several weeks. The timing seemed suspicious, and Hawthorne was starting to realize that his carefully planned lesson might have gone horribly wrong. Meanwhile, Blake's team was discovering that their situation was far worse than simple abandonment. Jasper had attempted to retrace their route out of the valley using his GPS and compass, but every trail seemed to lead deeper into unmarked wilderness or to dead ends against steep cliff faces. The maps that Kruger had marked for them appeared to be deliberately misleading, showing paths that did not exist and landmarks that were impossible to locate. Luna continued filming their attempts to navigate, documenting their growing frustration and fear as they realized they were truly lost in vast wilderness with no clear way home. On their 4th night alone, Cody was the first to notice that something was wrong beyond their navigation problems. While reviewing audio recordings from their camp, he discovered sounds that made no sense. There were footsteps circling their tent during the night, but none of the team members had left their sleeping bags after dark. The recordings also captured strange whistling sounds and what seemed like deliberate movement of their equipment while they slept. When Cody shared these recordings with the others, the team finally understood that they were not alone in the wilderness. Sienna's research background helped her recognize that the sounds were too deliberate and patterned to be natural wildlife behavior. Someone or something was deliberately stalking their camp, moving through the forest with skills that surpassed even Jasper's survival training. Blake tried to maintain leadership and keep the team calm, but privately, he was beginning to panic as he realized that their documentary project had become a fight for survival against an unknown threat. Vincent Merrick was enjoying his psychological game with the stranded filmmakers more than he had enjoyed anything in years. He had been stealing small items from their camp each night, moving their equipment to different locations and leaving subtle signs of his presence without revealing himself directly. Merrick wanted them to know they were being hunted before he made his final move, savoring their growing fear and confusion as they realized their helpless position. In his twisted mind, their terror was justice for violating his sacred wilderness, and he planned to drag out their suffering as long as possible. Gerald Hawthorne's unease was growing into full panic as he realized that 5 young people might die because of his petty need for control and revenge. He had tried to contact park rangers in the restricted area, but radio communications were nearly impossible in the deep wilderness where Blake's team was stranded. Hawthorne found himself lying awake at night, imagining the headlines and investigations that would follow if the filmmakers were found dead. His career would be destroyed, and he might face criminal charges for his role in their abandonment. But worse than his professional fears was the growing realization that his actions might have caused the deaths of 5 innocent people whose only crime was pursuing their dreams. If you believe that power-hungry bullies like Hawthorne and Merrick shouldn't be allowed to destroy innocent lives, comment, "Justice for the innocent," right now. Only sick people would support these twisted men who target defenseless victims. By their 6th day in the wilderness, Blake's team was running dangerously low on food and clean water. Jasper had found a reliable water source, but their meals were severely rationed, and the constant stress of being stalked was taking a psychological toll on everyone. Luna's camera batteries were nearly dead, but she continued filming whenever possible, instinctively understanding that their footage might be the only record of what happened to them. The team had tried building signal fires and using reflective surfaces to attract attention from any aircraft, but the dense forest canopy made them invisible from above. Vincent Merrick had been observing the filmmakers for nearly a week, and their increasing desperation was feeding his twisted satisfaction in ways he had never experienced before. During their 7th night in the wilderness, he decided it was time to escalate his psychological torture. While the exhausted team slept fitfully in their tent, Merrick crept close enough to touch the fabric walls, running his fingers along the material just inches from where Blake and Luna were sleeping. He whispered barely audible threats into the night air, words too quiet to fully wake them but loud enough to penetrate their dreams and fill their sleep with nameless dread. When morning came, the team discovered that their remaining food supplies had been scattered around the campsite with bite marks that looked human rather than animal. Their water purification tablets had been mixed with dirt, rendering them useless, and their spare batteries had been removed from their equipment cases and hidden throughout the forest. Most disturbing of all, someone had used mud and charcoal to write a single word on a flat rock near their tent. Mine. The message was clear and terrifying. They were not just lost in the wilderness. They were trapped in someone's twisted game. Blake's leadership was cracking under the pressure of their situation. He had convinced his 4 best friends to follow him into this nightmare, and the weight of responsibility for their safety was destroying him mentally. Luna tried to keep filming their ordeal, but her camera was down to its final battery, and she was saving power for what she feared might be their last messages to the outside world. Cody had stopped recording audio altogether to preserve his equipment's battery life, though he continued wearing his headphones to monitor for approaching threats. Sienna was using her research skills to identify edible plants and safe water sources, but their situation was deteriorating faster than she could find solutions. Jasper had taken over as the de facto leader of their survival efforts, using his training to establish security protocols and rationing systems that might keep them alive long enough for rescue. But even his military background had not prepared him for the psychological warfare being waged against them by an opponent who knew the terrain better than they ever could. Every night brought new evidence that their stalker was growing bolder, and Jasper's training told him that their unknown enemy was building toward some kind of violent confrontation. Gerald Hawthorne's guilt and panic had reached a breaking point. Unable to sleep or concentrate on his regular duties, he had begun making discreet inquiries about search and rescue operations in the restricted zones. But launching an official search would require him to explain how he knew the filmmakers were in danger, potentially exposing his role in their abandonment. Hawthorne found himself trapped between his desire to save the young people he had doomed and his fear of the consequences he would face if his actions were discovered. The Park Service had received concerned calls from Blake's family members, who had not heard from the team since their cheerful departure video over a week earlier. Standard procedure required waiting 48 hours before initiating search operations for overdue hikers, but the filmmakers had permits for areas that were considered relatively safe, and no one suspected they had ventured into the restricted wilderness zones. Hawthorne sat through planning meetings for limited search operations in the permitted areas, knowing that the teams would find nothing, while the real victims were trapped miles away in terrain that most rangers had never explored. Vincent Merrick's escalation continued on their 8th night in the wilderness. This time he cut guy lines on their tent while they slept, causing the structure to partially collapse and wake them in panic during a cold rainstorm. As they struggled to repair their shelter in the darkness, Merrick circled their campsite just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams, making noise that sounded like a large predator stalking prey. The psychological effect was devastating. Blake broke down completely, sobbing and begging the darkness for mercy while his friends tried to calm him and restore their shelter. Luna made the decision to use her camera's remaining battery power to record what she believed might be their final messages. She filmed each team member saying goodbye to their families, explaining their situation, and asking forgiveness for the dangerous adventure that had led to their disappearance. The footage was heartbreaking, showing 5 young people who had entered the forest full of dreams and enthusiasm, now facing the possibility that they would never see their loved ones again. But Luna's camera also captured something else in the background of Blake's goodbye message. A human silhouette standing motionless between the trees, watching them with predatory patience. When Sienna spotted the figure in Luna's viewfinder, she screamed and pointed toward the trees, but by the time the others looked, their stalker had melted back into the forest shadows. The brief glimpse was enough to confirm their worst fears. They were being hunted by someone who moved through the wilderness like a ghost, someone who had been toying with them for days while they grew weaker and more desperate. Jasper immediately began planning for direct confrontation, knowing that their opponent would eventually move beyond psychological torture to physical violence. If you're disgusted by predators like Merrick who hunt innocent people for their sick entertainment, smash that like button now. Only twisted individuals would support someone who terrorizes helpless victims in the wilderness. The 9th day brought a shift in Merrick's behavior that filled the filmmakers with new dread. Instead of his usual nocturnal harassment, he began appearing at the edges of their vision during daylight hours, always just far enough away to avoid clear identification, but close enough to maintain constant psychological pressure. The team could no longer focus on survival tasks without constantly scanning the forest for signs of their tormentor, and the exhaustion of perpetual vigilance was sapping their remaining strength faster than hunger or thirst. That afternoon, Vincent Merrick made his first direct contact with the terrified filmmakers. While Sienna was collecting water from the stream and the others were resting in camp, Merrick stepped out from behind a massive pine tree and spoke to her in a voice that sounded like rusted metal scraping against stone. "You don't belong here," he said simply, his appearance even more horrifying than his weeks of psychological torture had prepared her for. Merrick's hair and beard had grown wild and matted, his clothes were patched together from stolen camping gear and animal hides, and his eyes held the vacant stare of someone who had abandoned all connection to human civilization. Sienna's scream brought the others running, but by the time they reached the stream, Merrick had vanished again into the forest that he knew better than his own reflection. The brief encounter had accomplished exactly what he intended. The filmmakers now knew that their stalker was completely insane and operating far beyond the boundaries of normal human behavior. Jasper immediately began preparing weapons from their camping equipment, sharpening tent stakes and creating makeshift spears from hiking poles, while Blake finally accepted that their situation had moved far beyond a simple survival challenge. That night, Merrick launched his final assault on their sanity. He surrounded their camp and began making sounds that seemed designed to imitate every nightmare they had ever experienced. His voice echoed from different directions simultaneously, sometimes whispering their names, sometimes laughing like a hyena, and sometimes screaming threats that made no logical sense, but conveyed pure malevolent intent. Luna used her camera's last moments of battery life to capture audio of the terrifying sounds, creating a record that would later help investigators understand the horror these young people had endured. When morning came, the team discovered that Merrick had used their absence from camp during his psychological assault to destroy most of their remaining equipment. Their tent was shredded beyond repair, their sleeping bags were scattered and torn, and their remaining food supplies had been contaminated with substances that smelled like rotting flesh. Most disturbing of all, Merrick had used charcoal and mud to cover nearby trees with crude drawings that depicted stick figures being hunted and killed by a larger figure with wild hair and staring eyes. Jasper made the decision that they could no longer remain passive victims waiting for rescue that might never come. He convinced the others that their only chance for survival was to attempt an escape from the valley, even though they had no reliable maps and limited understanding of the surrounding terrain. The team spent their 10th day preparing for what they all understood might be a desperate final journey, creating crude packs from salvaged materials and gathering what little food and water they could carry. Gerald Hawthorne's world was collapsing around him as the investigation into Blake's missing team intensified. The families had hired private investigators who were asking uncomfortable questions about the permit process and the recommended guide service. Hawthorne had tried to cover his tracks by claiming that he had warned the filmmakers about the dangers of the restricted areas, but his lies were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as investigators discovered inconsistencies in his story. The guilt and stress were destroying his health, and he had begun drinking heavily to cope with the knowledge that 5 young people were probably dead because of his petty revenge. On their 11th night in the wilderness, Vincent Merrick finally moved beyond psychological torture to direct physical attack. While the exhausted team tried to sleep in the open air after the destruction of their tent, Merrick crept close enough to grab Cody by the ankle and drag him several feet away from the others before Jasper's improvised spear forced him to retreat into the darkness. The attack left Cody with deep scratches and a sprained ankle, but more importantly, it proved that their tormentor was prepared to escalate to violence and potentially murder. The team spent their final day in a state of terror that bordered on complete mental breakdown. Blake had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through desperate gestures and vacant stares. Luna clutched her dead camera like a security blanket, occasionally pressing the power button as if hoping for a miracle that would restore their connection to the outside world. Sienna had retreated into her research notes, obsessively cataloging plant species as if academic work could somehow protect her from their nightmare reality. Only Jasper maintained any semblance of functionality, desperately trying to keep his friends alive and sane while preparing for what he knew would be Merrick's final attack. Vincent Merrick had grown tired of his game with the filmmakers and decided that their time in his wilderness sanctuary was coming to an end. He had enjoyed their terror and suffering, but their continued presence was beginning to feel like a permanent contamination of his pure domain. That final night, he approached their makeshift camp with weapons he had crafted from salvaged metal and sharpened stones, ready to complete the elimination of these trespassers who had dared to invade his kingdom. The confrontation that followed was brief and brutal. Luna's camera, despite its dead battery, would later yield crucial evidence when forensic experts discovered that its internal memory had captured several seconds of footage during the attack. The recovered video showed Merrick lunging toward the camera with a crude knife raised above his head, his face twisted into an expression of pure predatory rage. The audio captured screaming and sounds of struggle before the recording ended abruptly. 6 years later, when park rangers finally discovered the hidden campsite during a routine patrol, they found evidence that painted a horrifying picture of the filmmakers' final days. The scattered remains of their equipment told the story of systematic psychological torture, followed by violent assault. Forensic experts determined that the site had been deliberately concealed under years of accumulated forest debris, suggesting that someone had taken great care to hide the evidence of what had happened there. The investigation that followed the discovery revealed the full scope of Gerald Hawthorne's criminal negligence and Vincent Merrick's systematic predation. Hawthorne was arrested and charged with reckless endangerment and conspiracy in the deaths of 5 young people, though he died of a heart attack in jail before facing trial. His confession, found among his personal papers, detailed his role in arranging the filmmaker's abandonment, and expressed his overwhelming guilt about the consequences of his actions. Merrick's wilderness camp was discovered 3 miles from where the filmmakers had died, containing evidence of his decade-long illegal residence in the restricted area and disturbing trophies from other victims who had never been reported missing. The forensic evidence suggested that Blake's team had not been Merrick's first victims, but rather the culmination of years of escalating violence against anyone who entered his self-declared territory. If you believe that monsters like Merrick and Hawthorne should never be allowed to destroy innocent lives, hit that subscribe button and comment, "Never again," to stand against predators who target the helpless. Only people with evil in their hearts would support these twisted individuals. The most chilling discovery came during the final search of the area, when rangers found fresh evidence that suggested the nightmare might not be over. A new camera lens, the same model that Blake's team had used, was discovered buried in fresh dirt near their original campsite. The lens showed signs of recent manufacture and had been placed deliberately where investigators would eventually find it. Somewhere in the vast wilderness, someone was still watching, still waiting, and still hunting anyone brave enough or foolish enough to venture into the forest that claimed 5 young dreamers who had only wanted to share the beauty of nature with the world.